Julius and Ethel Rosenberg face Judge Kaufman.
The issue of punishment in this case is presented in a unique framework of history. It is so difficult
You
to
ever
make
hear of
people
Ethel
realize
Rosenberg?
that this country...
Huh, Joe, huh? Maybe even read about her in the history books. Well, if it wasn't for me, Joe, Ethel Rosenberg would be alive today. Because during the trial, Joe, I was on the phone every day talking with the judge. Right. Every day doing what I do best. That sweet, unprepossessing woman. 2 kids, boo-hoo-hoo. Reminded us all of our little Jewish mamas. She came this close to getting life. I'd have fucking pulled the switch myself if they left. Because I fucking hate traitors. Because I fucking hate communists. Was it legal? Fuck legal. Am I a nice man? Fuck nice. They say terrible things about me in the nation. Fuck the nation. You want to be nice or you want to be offensive?
It is not in my power, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, to forgive you. You are hereby sentenced to the punishment of death.
Here, blah, 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 beep, blah, 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 and hello! Welcome to A People's History of Violence, the podcast where we go entirely too deep in history's assassinations, affairs, crimes, coups, conspiracies, cover-ups, terrors, and trials. I'm your co-host, Isaac.
And I'm your co-host, Peter.
You know, before we start off talking about our topic today, I'd like to give a couple of acknowledgments. Thank you to our new Patreon subscribers, Kit and Sarah.
Woo!
Thank you very much. You help us do our work and buy print books, among other things.
Mm-hmm. We got a stack of them here.
Topics like this. So what are we talking about today, Peter?
Well, we are coming to our long-awaited, hotly anticipated conclusion of the main line of our look at the Rosenberg case. When Isaac and I were talking about starting this podcast, we were like, we really need something that's hip, that the kids are into, and, show that we have our fingers on the pulse. So what else could we do but the Rosenberg?
And I manically said, yes, we're doing the Rosenbergs.
Yeah. In any event, this is the 5th episode. We've done a pretty deep dive, I think, into the background of the case. In prior episodes, we get to know the Rosenbergs. We get to know others around the case. We know that the case sort of began when the Rosenbergs' brother or brother-in-law, depending on which Rosenberg we're talking about, David Greenglass, snitched them to the federal government for conspiracy to commit espionage. We know that there was a trial with numerous advantages, shall we say, for the prosecution.
The big advantage being perjury.
Yeah, perjury's a pretty good one.
Stacks upon stacks of perjury.
Also, jury selection.
Yeah.
So, all kinds of skullduggery going on. We are now here at what should be the midpoint of the trial, where the prosecution has rested. The defense of the Rosenbergs is going to begin, except in certain respects this really isn't the halfway point, because we can't really look at the defense efforts and say that they amount to the effort put on by the prosecution. Do you want to explain why?
Yeah, so the defense in this case really just puts on 2 primary fact witnesses and then a couple of minor witnesses. And those would be Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They testify both in their own defense. And I think it's helpful at this point to explain, because this is an episode we're going to go into their attempt and failure to kind of counterattack the prosecution's case. That Julius and Ethel stole the secret of the atomic bomb, that Julius is a kind of like KGB spy master, essentially, a ringleader, a handler, and try to at least give the listener a sense of what their defense theory was. Because when this trial is wrapped up, and they're sentenced to death, that's when the real fights on this case begin, whether it's digging for evidence that prosecution's case from them or parts of it are lies, and attempts to get the public and leaders on board with trying to save their lives, to prevent the death sentence from being carried out.
Spoilers, they're sentenced to death.
Anyways, so it's helpful at this point to talk about what the basic defense theory of the case is. And that's how lawyers will talk about it. What is your theory of the case? What is the thing that says that if you're a prosecutor, that person you're prosecuting did X and Y offense? The defense case here is a variation of what's often called the SODI defense, which stands for SODDI. Some other dude did it. In this case, just the green glasses. The key problem with the prosecution's case here is that it's really just based on 2 or 3 witnesses say so. Their defense case, no matter what, the Rosenbergs, is going to rest on saying that those 2 to 3 witnesses are lying. And the problem is that they don't have any things like prior statements the green glasses made to the FBI or their lawyers or the grand jury that could be used to show that they're lying while they're on the stand. And that's why the defense is really fucked at this trial.
So just to be clear, were they entitled to that stuff?
So later on, the Supreme Court will create case law that says that you are entitled to that type of stuff. It eventually comes to be called Brady material after the case of Brady v. Maryland. We won't go into that. But if a witness says something that's exculpatory, it tends to show that the case against them is wrong or false or whatever, you do get entitled to that material nowadays. One of the classic cases of prosecutorial misconduct that you see all the time with wrongful conviction cases where the defendant's eventually proven innocent, mostly, are cases where they just didn't disclose the Brady material, often intentionally because it makes their case look bad. In this case, we've talked about how the green glasses had told different statements to the FBI, statements that especially showed that Ethel Rosenberg wasn't guilty, including an outright denial that Ethel was involved in any of this by David Greenglass. None of those statements were turned over to the defense. And if you don't have the statement, you can't question a witness on the stand and say, you're saying this now under oath, but look at what you told the FBI. Things that might cause a juror to doubt that they're saying the truth. So they're completely disarmed in that sense.
So the Brady decision just wasn't there in time for the Rosenbergs.
Doesn't happen until the Warren Court, baby.
Oh boy.
So I guess it would help at this point to talk about the basic defense theory of the case, which is either a variation of what defense lawyers call SODI, some other dude did it, i.e. the green glasses, or what defense attorneys also call they're lying. And that is essentially, and Manny Block made this case in his opening statement, he makes the case again in his closing argument, that David and Ruth Greenglass, the Rosenbergs in-laws, are dirty, rotten, confessed spies. Because no one's going to contest that, right?
It's the basis of their whole testimony.
It's the basis of their testimony, that I am a dirty, rotten spy. My brother-in-law made me be dirty, rotten spy. So that's why they're guilty. But they say David and Ruth are dirty, rotten spies. Therefore, they did a crime. They want to save their own skin. And that being dirty, rotten spies, they lie all of the time. That's part of their work. And in this case, they lied to the FBI, the prosecutor, and now the jury under oath to save their own skin. But like I said, the problem is that without their prior statements to the FBI, to the grand jury, that are different than their trial testimony, he can't really show that well that they're lying, just that they have motive to lie.
Right.
So the best evidence that they can really put on, at least at the time of the trial, are Julius and Ethel themselves denying these claims. And Julius does this pretty well. I mean, reading it at first, when Manny Block puts Julius Rosenberg on the stand to deny the accusations against him, he actually has a pretty good rhythm and he's unfazed, even when Judge Kaufman is intervening and directly questioning, kind of cross-examining Julius Rosenberg like a prosecutor, as his attorney is having him bring out these through softball questions, his own story. And it starts out pretty well. Julius is a calm, collected, witness, at least in the beginning of this direct examinations, where his lawyer is asking the softball questions to bring out the testimony. And he's even cool under pressure when Judge Kaufman himself intervenes, kind of acts like a prosecutor and cross-examines Julius himself in the middle of this examination. And I mean in a very hostile way. He asks these oh yeah, or gotcha questions that no doubt signal to the jury that he, the judge, doesn't believe what the witness is saying. But he's careful. He doesn't go over the line and say he's lying or something like that. So Julius is asked this chorus of accusations, essentially, from David and Ruth Greenglass, and he answers each one of them with, I did not. So something like, did you give Ruth Greenglass $150 to use for espionage purposes? I did not. We should take Mike Mirapol's approach to heart here and admit the times. Julius says a number of these I did nots to stuff that we know almost certainly he did. Yeah. So he denies that he knew that David Greenglass was working on the atom bomb project at Los Alamos. We know from David and Ruth's letters that that's untrue. Yeah. We also know that from Nona and from zillion of notebooks. He denies that. Anyways, some of these denials, however, are true. He's asked, for example, if David passed the sketch of the atomic bomb to him. He denies that. He says that didn't happen. He's asked if a number of meetings with David happened. And also specifically, he's asked about a lot of payoffs that David and Ruth said that he did, including one where he gave him $200. And that almost certainly was given to David Greenglass by David Greenglass's own KGB officer. So of course he would want to transfer responsibility from that to Julius, because it makes him 1 degree removed at least from an actual Soviet spy handler. It makes him seem like he's a smaller part of this operation. That Julius denied, and that is actually true. For most of these payoff questions, Julius didn't do a payoff to David. He was already out on his ass as an agent. He wasn't working for the KGB, or at least he was frozen or suspended at the time, while David was receiving payoffs in the form of money, at least 2 that we know of, from KGB agents. And there's a pretty convincing part of this, at least I would think so for a jury, where there's more denials. And Julius actually talks a bit about how broke he and Ethel were at the time. And it's not the picture you would get of a Soviet paid agent. Normally when they look at spies, they're like, where is this extra income coming from? Like with Robert Hansen. Yeah. Where was he getting the houses and the jewelry for his wife? With Julius, there's nothing like that. So from the transcript here, Manny Block asked Julius, did you tell Ruth or David Greenglass that you were entertaining and spending $50 or $75 a night in connection with your espionage work? I didn't tell Dave or Ruth Greenglass or anybody that. Did you ever entertain anybody or any espionage work? I did not. Tell me, how many suits have you bought for the last 11 years? About 5 suits. Keep in mind, a suit is what you wore these days. In those days.
No, it's not. It's not
like how much clothes you got. Did you come into court with a coat? Yes, sir. When did you buy that coat? I would say it was either 1941 or 1942. Did you ever buy a winter overcoat since then? Literally since World War II. No, sir, I did not. How much did you pay for that coat? He estimates it's about $55. And this goes on. They also talk about the infamous console table, which Julius says he thinks he got about $21.
Love that table.
And notably, everything that he talks about buying here is before he was trying to throw together this machine shop business with David Greenglass. It's all during World War II when he and everyone around him is gainfully employed in the defense industry, this kind of quasi-socialist command economy.
See episodes 1 and 2.
Yeah.
Mainly 2, I think.
But of course, what we do know is David was lying about getting all these payoffs from Julius, and the prosecution was lying to think that Julius had those. When he was doing the stuff during World War II, he was doing it because he believed in helping the Soviets. And that's the missing piece of that part. But the next important part of Julius's testimony is kind of implicating why David would name him, right? So David's a spy. He has to save his own skin when he's captured by the FBI. A jury gets that, but that kind of begs the question of, all right, why
your brother-in-law?
Yeah, why your brother-in-law, and then why your sister? Right? Really, you sold out your own sister to save your skin when no one would have known about that otherwise? At least that's what the jury thinks. And so Julius gives a bit of the history of how he came to realize David was in trouble. And there's some half-truths here. Like, this is a history where some of these statements, I think, actually happened. Mm-hmm. But it's definitely not the whole story.
Hard to tell.
Yeah. So, as we described on episode 3, the Pit Machine Shop, that business that Julius Rosenberg and David Greenglass had, it was failing in this kind of faltering post-war economy before the Korean War. David couldn't get his shares back, or at least couldn't get the money back for his shares in this little business, so he starts hating Julius. And they even had some heated arguments or fights about this that were witnessed by David's brother. And it's this kind of animosity that is still in David's head and Ruth's head when the FBI comes around asking about maybe some stolen uranium that David might have taken from Los Alamos. So Julius points out that, or Julius states when he's testifying, that in February of 1945, before the war's over and when David's working at Los Alamos, Ruth, David's wife, came to him and said, I think that David's about to do something very risky. He's talking about making money by taking some things off the base. And Julius, in his own thing, says, tell David not to do that. And I'm of two minds about this. You know, I talked on one of our episodes about how Walter and Miriam Schneer actually found out that the Greenglasses seem to have a lot of payments and a lot of deposits of money that aren't accounted for, even now from spy payments. And I do think that in that time of wartime rationing, it's very possible that a kind of a schemer guy like David Greenglass might have taken some gas, some tires,
some bacon,
some slabs of bacon off the base where they were readily available and sold them out in Albuquerque or Santa Fe or wherever. So I could see Ruth saying, in addition to our spy work that we're doing for a good cause, David wants to sell stuff off the base, and I feel like that's not a good idea. And if you were a spy like Julius was, you absolutely would have told him, no, don't do that.
Yeah.
That's exposure.
Yes.
That'll get you caught, which it did. So the FBI comes around asking about this uranium in Julius's account. And then months later, David comes around Julius's machine shop and says, I'm in trouble. He confronts Julius. He says he needs $2,000 right now. He won't say what he needs it for. And he also asks Julius, like, hey, can you get your doctor to write me a smallpox vaccination? Because I need that to get to Mexico. To which Julius says, why? He says, I can't talk about it. According to this testimony. Julius, however, thinks about this, and he puts this together with what he heard from David about the FBI asking about uranium, and he thinks, oh, man, David might be some real trouble.
Yeah.
He might have stolen stuff off the base and sold it.
Not necessarily just tires.
Right. But the big stuff that you really, really, really can't steal. And then he has a further confrontation with David where he says, if you don't get me that money, you're going to be sorry. So I actually think that some of these things happened.
Right.
I think there was a confrontation about getting money because from the files that we know that Julius asked David to leave the country, and David said, not before you give me some money, because David had $3,000 in debt. So Julius did get him that money from the Soviets. But it's an interesting because it's able to pull into the picture things that probably happened.
Right, along with denials of things that did.
Right, or at least explanations for the things where there's more witnesses to it than David and Ruth Greenglass. So at this point, this is a fairly convincing story. You got two spies. They implicate Julius and Ethel because of animosity towards Julius. That bastard wouldn't give me my money.
Right.
I hate him, etc. It's not the most convincing motive because why would he put his sister in there? And this is why, frankly, more convincing explanations of why David and Ruth did what they did came later on when people were re-examining the case. But what really screws Julius's testimony here is he gives an explanation for why he would defend the Soviet Union and maybe make some statements that were sympathetic. But then he begins invoking the Fifth Amendment right as he's questioned. So on direct examination, when he's talking to the jury and through questions from his attorney, Manny Block. He says, when he's asked about the Soviet Union and what he would have said back then during World War II, Julius says, I felt that the Soviet government had improved a lot of the underdog there, had made a lot of progress in eliminating illiteracy, has done a lot of reconstruction work, and built up a lot of resources. And the same I felt that they contributed their major share in destroying the Hitler beast, which exterminated 6 million of my co-religionists. That means a lot to me, he says. Now, when the prosecutor, Irving Sapol, gets up for cross-examination, he doesn't go into any of these events as described right away. Instead, 2 questions, he just starts by asking about his CCNY classmates. And 2 questions in, Julius invokes the Fifth Amendment. And there is very little that you can do to destroy your credibility before a jury, to make it seem like you're lying, then say, I'm not going to answer that question on the grounds it may incriminate me.
Yeah, that's kind of, people talk about the Fifth Amendment like it's this, and obviously it is good that you can't be compelled to testify against yourself, but it seems to have this kind of opposite effect of harming your defense.
There's very little things you can do to seem like you're lying than say, I'm not going to answer that question because it might implicate me in a crime. Which is why you can't be compelled to testify. You usually invoke that right by not actually getting up on there on the stand. But it really screws you. I mean, Patty Hearst did the same thing. She got up on the stand, she gave her story, and then when she got in trouble, she started invoking the Fifth Amendment, and that destroyed her case. The same thing happens here with both Julius, and when Ethel gets up to testify, she largely corroborates Julius. She describes similar events that she was present for. She describes a conversation where Julius came to her and said, I think David's in a lot of trouble. But when asked by the prosecutor and by the judge, who's supposed to be this impartial friend of the jury, gets the facts out, why she was invoking the Fifth Amendment, she just completely gets tangled up in this. She's also asked, why'd you invoke the Fifth Amendment before the jury, not answer their questions if you're not invoking the Fifth Amendment now and answering the government's questions? And today you can't be compelled to answer that. You actually can't even ask a question about why they took the Fifth Amendment before the grand jury.
Was that another Warren Court thing?
Yeah.
No wonder that chuds of a legal history bent hate the Warren Court so much.
John Birch Society had a campaign to get him impeached.
Wow.
Have billboards up. So this is where, frankly, I think we can say that Rosenberg's defense really just crashes and burns. It's not on the prosecutor really pulling out some kind of Perry Mason moment where he proves through a piece of evidence that they're lying. It's because he was asking questions repeatedly about friends of theirs, people they knew, trying to get them to name names or implicate them as being communists. And this is what gave rise to the whole notion that this was a political trial, because in a large respect it was. The prosecutor was just trying to show they are communists, therefore they stole secrets, and therefore they gave those secrets to the Soviet Union, because that's what they would want to do.
Right.
I'm not sure how they would have gotten out of that spot. Had they just admitted that they were communists or members of the Communist Party, I think that the prosecutor would have then gotten them to name names and then drawn up indictments for those people.
Oh, yeah. Well, they could have said they were Trotskyites. Sorry.
Except for those cursed Trotskyites.
Yeah.
So the prosecution, after the defense rested with Julius and Ethel, was allowed to bring in rebuttal witnesses. And they bring in one witness who I think the defense was right to think that they're just a plant. Part of the prosecution's case is that Julius asked David to go ahead and get his passport photos taken in order to flee the country. And that Julius similarly would have had his passport photos taken, one would think, because being the spy master, why wouldn't he also flee the country? In fact, it would be strong evidence that he's not involved in espionage if he's not fleeing the country and everybody else is. But no such photographer had turned up at that point. The FBI gets a tip from their jailhouse informant / fabricator Jerome Eugene Tardico, who I hope to do an episode about.
Bonus episode, folks. You gotta pay us.
Who is sitting in jail with Julius, listening to him, playing chess with him, and so on. And so Tardico tells the FBI and with no prompting, supposedly, even though it's almost certainly the case the FBI agents were like, did Julius say anything about passport photos? And then Tardico came up with, Julius was really curious the other day if it was possible for the FBI to search all of the photography places and find a photographer who took their photos. He was wondering if, as a photographer, later arrested on many counts of pornography, including child pornography, if as a photographer I knew if the FBI could do that. So taking this hot lead, the FBI then supposedly canvassed passport photo taking places and found one that was conveniently very close to the Foley Square courthouse where the trial took place. Now, I have to say, at first when I read this, I thought that, just happens to be next to the courthouse. Like, why would the Rosenbergs go there? But I have to say, I did walk from 10 Morton Street to the Foley Square courthouse almost by accident. It's like a 10-minute walk.
Oh, okay.
But still, this is very convenient for the prosecutors. Yes. So they bring in this guy, this ringer, a definitely truthful witness who I'm sure only wants to participate in this extremely public case for the best of reasons.
He's a citizen crime fighter.
Yeah. So he testifies that he did take Julius and Ethel Rosenberg's passport photos, presumably to help them flee the country. But can you guess what evidence he has of that, Peter?
I mean, I assume he has like a receipt.
Nope.
All right. Well, that's not disqualifying because he's a photographer. So you'd have photographic negatives of their faces.
No.
Well, got it like a sign-in sheet. You gotta what? I don't know about this.
Yeah, also, he says he remembers this specific day because he wasn't normally open during that time. They kind of, Julius and Ethel just kind of clambered in.
As you do.
Yeah, so this didn't happen.
Yeah. Were they even trying to get themselves out of the country at that point?
So not as much. So from what we have from the Soviet archives, they were really trying to get David out of the country.
Right.
It's not as if he wasn't trying to assist David getting out of the country. He got him a cash drop. He was going to do another dead drop of money at some later point. But there's not, and there are some some plans of if this doesn't work out, if we can't get David's wife out, Julius and David might just have to go on their own, send for their wives later. But there's no evidence in the archives that Julius actually took steps to leave the country.
Right, because it was David who they were going after first.
Right, David was the next link in the chain from what the FBI had found before with Klaus Fuchs and Harry Gold.
Yeah.
So at the close of the evidence on this case, after that ringer testimony, not that it was terribly important by this point.
Right.
This jury of, as we said before, American Legion members, friends of the FBI, auditors, estimators.
All American types.
Find Julius and Ethel guilty of conspiracy to commit espionage. There was a dissenting view from one of the jurors, who actually happened to be a former union member himself, as to whether the jury should plead and recommend for Ethel to be spared the death penalty. Because as the judge informed them, however, Judge Kaufman told them that the death sentence, and any sentence, was not within their power. No recommendation would be done by them or considered. So with that taken out, they were just supposed to find the factual question of whether they were guilty or not guilty. They found guilty. And a week later, Judge Kaufman, the member of the prosecution team, essentially pronounced his sentence on the case. Kaufman said at the sentencing of Julius and Ethel, quote, "Because of the seriousness of this case and the lack of precedence, I have refrained from asking the government for a recommendation." In other words, he says that he's making this decision himself. He hasn't asked anyone for a recommendation.
He searched his conscience.
Yes, he searched his conscience, consulted his family, etc. In fact, he had asked Irving Sapel, the lead prosecutor on the case, for a recommendation. He asked Roy Cohn, Donald Trump's future lawyer, and also on the prosecution team, for a recommendation. He asked J. Edgar Hoover for a recommendation, and he asked 2 other judges for recommendations.
I don't imagine he asked Manny Block.
No, and that's exactly the issue here, is if people are making recommendations, they submit documents to the court, and then the defense can argue against those. They can say, that point is wrong. That thing that you said was evidence is untrue. Kaufman, by saying and lying, just openly lying in court, and saying that he didn't ask for a recommendation immunizes all of them against that.
Mm-hmm.
And when a judge gives a sentence, they're supposed to give reasons in the sworn testimony, the facts of the case, the evidence for why they're pronouncing that sentence.
Mm-hmm.
If it's something like a death sentence, it might be something like, it should be something along the lines of what made this murder
Right.
so bad.
Right.
Why there isn't any mitigation.
Mm-hmm.
But Judge Kaufman's his sentencing statement is absolutely insane. So, and here's the relevant part. He says in open court, I consider your crime worse than murder. Plain, deliberate, contemplated murder is dwarfed in magnitude by comparison with the crime you have committed. In committing the act of murder, the criminal only kills his victim. The immediate family is brought to grief, and when justice is meted out, the chapter is closed. But in your case, I believe your conduct in putting into the hands of the Russians the A-bomb years before our best scientists predicted Russia would perfect the bomb has already caused, in my opinion, the communist aggression in Korea, with the resultant casualties exceeding 50,000, and who knows what millions more of innocent people may pay the price of your treason. Indeed, by your betrayal, you undoubtedly have altered the course of history to the disadvantage of our country. He literally says they caused the Korean War.
Yikes. Yeah, well, you're not supposed to do that. Cause Korean wars.
Yeah. And Harold Urey, the Nobel Prize winning physicist who worked on the Manhattan Project, is in the audience at this point. Mm-hmm. And up to this time, he's been very agnostic on the question of their guilt, leaning towards maybe Julius and Ethel were guilty. And when he hears some of the evidence about, they stole the secret of the atomic bomb, he starts getting increasingly skeptical about the case because he knows you can't do that.
Right.
It's
he
not
knows the secrets.
It's not a thing that you can just write down on paper and you've got it.
Right.
And this death sentence to him comes across as an absolute absurdity, just a horrific bullshit statement on the record. They didn't cause the Korean War. They didn't even steal the secret of the atomic bomb,
right,
even if they were guilty.
Mm-hmm.
And as Marshall Perlin, who becomes the attorney for the Rosenberg sons, Michael Meeropol and Robert Meeropol later on, says, more people than you would think thought they were guilty, but thought this death sentence was cruel, unusual, excessive, and even absurd. Klaus Fuchs, accused of really stealing atomic secrets and found guilty of it, he's given time in prison. He's not given a lifetime in prison. He's given time in prison, and he lives out his life in East Germany until he released in the 50s and gets out and stays there until he grows old.
And that was the British, in a sense. So what was so different? Why the need to pin all of this on the Rosenbergs and have them pay with their lives?
I think by this point, they need, even if they were guilty of what they were accused of, the nation needed a true scapegoat for this stab in the back. Why was it that the Soviet Union now had the power of the atomic bomb? Couldn't have been because their system allowed them to develop it as such. It had to have been betrayal, a stab in the back. And I think I showed you, there was even a demonstrator, a Rosenbergs must get killed, pro-death sentence demonstrator, who had a sign that said they stabbed us in the back.
Oh, yeah, I saw that.
I should say, Peter, that explains why people in the American public and even people like the president would have supported the death penalty in this case. But it's not really why it was brought about so definitively here. And that reason is because the death penalty was going to be a torture device that would put maximum pressure on Julius. And they also sort of believed Ethel, even though they knew that Julius was the one more likely to have information, to talk, to implicate other leftists, other former CCNY classmates, and have an expanding circle of espionage suspects that could themselves be put under the knife and implicate others until you round up the entire Communist Party and anyone associated with them, fellow travelers and the like. In that respect, I guess there's a grain of truth to what Julius said in a public letter about the death sentence. He said, "This death sentence is not surprising. It had to be. There had to be a Rosenberg case. There had to be a Rosenberg case because there had to be an intensification of the hysteria in America to make the Korean War acceptable to the American people. There had to be a hysteria and a fear sent through America in order to get increased war budgets. And there had to be a dagger thrust in the heart of the left to tell them that you were no longer going to get 5 years for a Smith Act prosecution or 1 year for contempt of court, presumably for not talking and implicating other leftists. But we're going to kill you, Julius says.
In that case, the death sentence passed on Ethel is important, not just because maybe she has information, but as a way to get Julius to talk.
Exactly. If you don't talk, not just going to kill you, you revolutionary martyr, we're going to kill your wife. Your kids aren't going to have a mother.
Yeah. And
that was held over Julius's head as well. So after this death sentence was pronounced, one should say the Communist Party doesn't come to Julius and Ethel's rescue. They've already completely divested themselves from this case because they're already facing potentially being made entirely illegal. The Smith Act prosecutions that have already been going on since the late 40s have put most of their leadership in prison, and many of them won't get out of prison until the late 50s, early 60s. They're facing the prospect that most of their membership might be put in prison in their view. So the last thing they want to do is be implicated in espionage or in being seen to support espionage. But this kind of gives this opening for something that I feel like is a forerunner of kind of new left, Communist Party, non-party affiliated left-wing politics in the form of a bunch of, as Mike Mirapol calls them, mavericks. So the husband and wife team of Emily and David Allman really are at the forefront of founding the Committee to Secure Justice in the Rosenberg Case, which comes about as Emily Allman, who lived in the same building as Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, Knickerbocker Village, begins reading about the case from an article that was published by a journalist named William Rubin for a long since defunct newspaper called the National Guardian, which was kind of an independent left-wing newspaper, non-communist affiliated, but still very left-wing. And his essential argument at that time was that David had motive to lie, Ruth had motive to lie, and the entire case rests on their testimony. There's reasonable explanations for everything Julius and Ethel did. So there's major doubts about this case. Not conclusive proof of innocence, but you should doubt this case. And when she saw that, she started up a group which was joined by a load of non-sectarian old left people who have been expelled from the Communist Party in the case of, or who had left in the case of David Allman, her husband, and others, some of them trade unionists, some of them lawyers, some kind of sympathetic religious types who were either appalled by the death penalty on the case or had doubts about the verdict. And the last thing you want to do is allow a death sentence to go forward when there's doubts about the case. One of their more famous signs on pickets and everything was the death penalty can't kill the doubts about the Rosenberg case. So their goal was to win support for a new trial, or as a second goal, as the minimum goal, to get clemency and commutation of the death sentence, to save Julius and Ethel Rosenberg's life. And from the beginning, they kind of had a two-front war, which is how to generate even the public pressure that you would need to get someone like Harry Truman or Dwight Eisenhower to commute the death sentence. You had to actually educate the public about the case.
Right.
Because as far as the public knew, Julius and Ethel were two communists found guilty on a load of evidence that had been examined by the best law enforcement agency in the country, the FBI, which doesn't make mistakes, and they're guilty. They're super guilty. Not only they're guilty, but they're guilty of giving the secret of the atomic bomb to the Soviet Union, who were now fighting the Korean War. So they're basically enemies of everyone. That's the most the public at least knew about the case, unless they were readers of the National Guardian and maybe one other paper.
Yeah.
So first they had to try to educate the public about that and bring forward evidence by making pamphlets, by handing out newspapers, by holding what would later be called teach-ins, like seminars about the case, and demonstrations where they would talk about major doubts about the case. But as this built from 1951 all the way leading up to the execution in 1953, they began having demonstrations, round-the-clock pickets of the White House to try to get clemency and exert this public pressure. They were calling up congressmen, and this became really a grassroots citizens movement. Most of their money didn't come from any kind of like large trade union coffers, let alone the Communist Party. It was from people sending in like $1,
Right.
$5,
Yeah, it's pretty amazing given
coins in
Right.
envelopes.
Oh yeah, it's pretty amazing given the the coverage of the trial that they got as many people as they did. Because it's just such a, as someone who's done like flyering and stuff, it seems like such a zero proposition. Like, hey, you want to help these convicted spies that you've been hearing the whole time were just dirty spies? You want to help them out? They're actually innocent, and like it just seems like such an uphill battle. But it seems like they accomplished a fair amount, at least in terms of getting grassroots going.
I mean, they got tens of thousands of people on the streets
Yeah,
in demonstrations.
yeah,
And when they started doing this kind of work, Communist Party officials came up to Emily David Ullman and basically told him to knock it off. You're making this hard for us.
yeah,
We don't want to be a part of this.
yeah.
That isn't to say that individual Communist Party members weren't sympathetic. For what they saw was that two comrades got railroaded and are going to be murdered by the state. I mentioned that this is a two-front war. One front was public pressure, which has that all uphill battle of getting the public to have the knowledge about the case. The other front is the legal front, that Manny Block is trying to appeal this case, and they actually do a fair bit of essentially kind of detective work, or at least publicity work on behalf of the work of others, about new evidence that's eventually found in this case. And they are actually responsible in a not minor way for eventually finding two huge pieces, like bombshell pieces of evidence at the final hour that introduced a lot of doubts about the prosecution case. So it's probably worth talking, and I'll try not to get too legal nerd about this, how the defense tried to win a new trial first off. So you have the first set of appeals, and that's, at that time, those are the only appeals that they're truly entitled to, where you're just appealing from the verdict of the trial court to a higher court. And this process takes a while, from about the pronouncement of the verdict, so April 5th, 1951, all the way to about, really all the way up until about May 25th of 1953, with this first round there and round back of appeals up to the Supreme Court. And something important to note about these rounds of appeals, the Supreme Court never actually heard the case. So they never had someone argue about the merits of the case and whether the evidence was actually sufficient at trial to convict these people. What they heard, let me back up. Something to know about the Supreme Court: they don't have to hear any case. They can just let whatever happens at the circuit court level and the trial courts do whatever they want. They try to hear cases to settle causes or controversies. And the way they decide whether they hear a case is someone presents them with what's called a writ of certiorari, and all that has to happen is 4 of the 9 justices vote to grant that writ, and then they get to hear the case.
Okay. So when a trial lawyer is like, we're taking this all the way to the Supreme Court, unless they've got, some sort of, like you said, like a cause, or like there's some constitutional relevance to what their case is probably not going to get those 4 votes to get put before the Supreme Court, unless they've got like political juice or something.
Right. Of course, you would think that the most controversial case in not just the country, but the world would get that. But there's a fair amount of cowardice on the part of the Supreme Court. And what I learned by reading about this case, and in particular, I owe a debt to a book a guy named Bradley Snyder, called Taking Great Cases, Lessons from the Rosenberg Case. And also he put out a biography recently of Justice Felix Frankfurter, is that this group of people on the Supreme Court were a bunch of backstabby, gossipy little shits.
Yeah. Not exactly these giants of legal majesty, like Brett Kavanaugh.
There's a lot of nostalgia for a time when the Supreme Court weren't complete political hacks. And here's the thing. The Supreme Court had a fair amount of political hacks on there at the time, but in many instances, they were political hacks for the political party of themselves. So the Supreme Court at that time was headed by a justice called Fred Vinson. Vinson, along with a couple of other justices, 3 other justices, had kind of a clique, a party of his own in the Supreme Court that was widely referred to and derided as Harry Truman's law firm. Because whatever Harry Truman, the president, wanted at that time, they would rule in his favor.
Interesting.
overwhelming majority of the Supreme Court at the time had been appointed by FDR and were New Dealers at one time or another, but that New Deal coalition really ran the gamut from right to left, especially when it came to questions of legal procedure and what a judge could do at trial or what a police or prosecutor could do to you. Kind of holding the, what I could call like the consistent left-winger wing in this case to some degree was Jewish Justice Felix Frankfurter. I always found that name funny.
Yeah, right.
So Frankfurter himself kind of is distinguished by the fact that he was a huge public campaigner to save the life and overturn the verdicts of Sacco and Vanzetti before they were executed. And really, he played a huge part in swinging elite opinion and educated opinion on that case towards thinking that Sacco and Vanzetti were innocent, or at least that they were denied a fair trial. And even though, by all accounts, Frankfurter believed that Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were probably guilty, actually, he believed that they were definitely guilty, and that the case wasn't the same as Sacco and Vanzetti, he still plays a big part in saying they didn't receive a fair trial, at least in private among the justices, and he does fight the most to try to get their case heard at the Supreme Court level. That effort ultimately fails. So one of the people who actually, at the time got a lot of praise and has since been found to be kind of a prima donna, manic pixie dream judge, I don't know what you call him, was William O. Douglas, who's kind of a hero to liberals, especially, legal nerd liberals.
Yeah.
William Douglas, as it happens behind the scenes, seems to be seeking out, I'm going to try to advance this theory, William Douglas wanted to be able to vote to have the case heard at the Supreme Court, the Rosenberg case, but wanted there to be enough votes against that it wouldn't matter.
Okay.
And
so he wanted to be that third vote.
He wanted to be the third vote
without there being a fourth.
And to go, oh no!
Yeah.
The problem is that there consistently were 3 other votes.
Right.
It's worth clarifying something before I go into this, which is there's 2 things that these judges have the ability to do here at the Supreme Court. They have the ability to grant certiorari and hear the case, hear actually all the merits of the case and examine the trial record. And they also have the ability, and even just one justice can do this, to grant a stay of execution. To hit the pause button on the death clock.
Any Supreme Court justice can do that.
Yes.
Independent of the others.
Yeah, and I mean that exists now. So right now, there's a justice that's assigned to each region of the country. Essentially,
a Supreme Court justice?
Yeah, well, they're assigned to a federal circuit district to hear cases brought to them for just a stay or a pause in the execution clock. If something new has been discovered, or if there's some mitigating circumstance that should be brought before the court. There's always that possibility that a Supreme Court justice, although often with like the Fifth Circuit, which carries out a lot of the executions, it's a very conservative justice, hits the pause button on that
How do they
clock.
choose who's in charge of which circuit?
Now that, I think, varies from court to court.
Okay, yeah, who's to say?
Yeah.
So it's just magic.
I'm sure someone actually has an answer.
There's a sorting hat.
People who specialize in capital defense cases, which
I
certainly never even got close to that.
Have them all put on the sorting robe. You get to go to Texas.
Some ghoul conservative judge like Alito being like, yes! Yeah. So in this first round of appeals, the Rosenbergs lawyers, Manny Block heading the team, identified 3 basic issues that they said that the higher court should vacate the verdict of the trial court for it. So they have to bring this to Judge Kaufman again for him to laugh at them and deny their motion, and then they can go up to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals before hopefully taking it to the Supreme Court. Their 3 issues were that Judge Kaufman himself improperly questioned witnesses, which he did, although he kind of sort of stayed in the bounds. The second issue was that they couldn't be sentenced to death under the Espionage Act because they weren't doing anything to harm the United States. The Soviet Union and the United States were allies at the time that all of the espionage alleged trial happened. And 3, their death sentences violated the 8th Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment because they were portrayed as traitors to the United States, but they weren't given the protections of the treason clause. In other words, they said they had committed treason, but the treason clause in the United States Constitution actually says all of the requirements that a prosecutor has to prove in order to actually find someone guilty for treason. So to clarify a little bit, because I know this is confusing, the Constitution says that treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them, against the United States, or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. No person shall be convicted of treason unless on the testimony of 2 witnesses to the same overt act or a confession in open court. In other words, something historical about this is the British like to prosecute something called constructive treason, where anything that kind of inhibited or messed with the operation of the British state was also a little bit treason.
Yeah.
And there was this
Henry VIII liked that one.
Yeah. There's this ever-expanding definition of treason. You can see how under that definition, you could start expanding treason to include things like a railway strike.
Yep.
Or making fun of a congressperson or threatening them doesn't just become a crime, if that is a crime, but treason, which can lead to death.
Yes. Back in the old days, really spectacular death.
Yeah. There's actually some merit to that argument, but it's, as you can tell, because I've had to explain it 3 times to even get it across myself, that is a very deep in the text, legally one.
Can't expect judges to pay attention to that.
No, although 3 justices of the Supreme Court actually did like this argument. Felix Frankfurter, Hugo Black, and Judge Burton. And in 1952, Justice Jackson, who kind of operated as one of the 2 swing votes here, the other one being prima donna William Douglas, Judge Jackson granted a stay of execution on the basis of this argument. Not any of the arguments that are going to come later on that are very much sexier and more interesting, I'll say.
Stay tuned, folks.
Harry Truman's law firm and the rest of the court called themselves into session and overruled Justice Jackson and the small Frankfurter dissenting group and got rid of the stay, because 4 votes can get you heard before the Supreme Court, but it's not enough to pause the clock on the execution if the rest of the Supreme Court votes against you. Feel free to ask me what I mean.
Jesus. Okay.
So to clarify,
this is some Holy Roman Empire ass shit. This is just stupid.
Yeah. As a side note, there was a little skullduggery going behind the scenes in the Supreme Court, in addition to this kind of high school musical chair stuff of how many votes they got for this or that, which is Judge Jackson, who was somewhat sympathetic to granting some kind of a hearing to the Rosenbergs, although he consistently voted against hearing the case. He wanted to stay the clock and not have them executed, maybe for other courts to figure it out. Had a clerk by the name of William Rehnquist.
We know that one.
A smart whippersnapper of a young man at the time, and it turns out, as I learned from this case, in addition to being a conservative judge, was an absolute bloodthirsty ghoul. So, in addition to writing, a legal memo about, why the court should grant a stay or deny a stay, he, in fighting to some extent with Justice Jackson, his boss, wrote in a memo, "It is too bad that drawing and quartering has been abolished in the case of the Rosenbergs." He also said, "I think I would recommend a deny, as in deny hearing the case, if the trial judge had refused them a hearing on allegations that they had been put on the rack before trial." In other words, even if they are
been literally tortured.
Even if they've been literally tortured, in other words, if justice had been totally done, he would still want to deny hearing.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, you feel like if he was probably walking around with those medieval torture references in his back pocket, just waiting for the opportunity to use them.
His William Rehnquist one-liners. So to our Zoomers in the audience, William Rehnquist later becomes the chief judge of the Supreme Court, and stays that all the way until the George W. Bush administration.
Right. Among other things, he oversaw the court during the Bush v. Gore decision, which handed the presidency to George W. Bush, essentially because conservatives wanted to, and liberals weren't going to fight them enough on it. So
certainly not in the streets. They thought this would play out all in the court.
Yeah.
Should have stopped him here.
reticent telegram he had sent to the president.
For sake of American tradition, prestige, and influence, urge redress for Rosenberg. Demand you be afforded sufficient time to consider this serious matter.
More public pressure builds thanks to the efforts of the Committee to Secure Justice in the Rosenberg case and all of that hard shoe leather, actual organizing work done by the Almonds and many, many others working for them, especially in major cities like New York and so on. And this public pressure becomes particularly big, however, abroad, much like with the earlier Sacco and Vanzetti case. In other countries, the imminent execution of the Rosenbergs is seen, in particular, as almost like kind of a replay of the Nazi era, in which a sham trial with possibly perjured testimony is used to send, two Jewish people to the electric chair. And that's particularly the case in France, where the Rosenberg case is a massive, massive cause célèbre. And that actually means that there.
Yeah, right? Yeah.
In particular because of the history with the Dreyfus case and the Dreyfus affair.
We might do a series on that one of these days.
Maybe one of these days. So, abroad, at one point, the non-communist but still very left-wing Parisian newspaper called Le Combat receives a couple of items in an envelope. The editorial board of Le Combat, of course, has been raising the doubts about the Rosenberg case, but in this envelope comes two pieces of evidence that appear to directly show that the green glasses are lying. And these two pieces of evidence come to be known as the Rogue Papers. O. John Rogue, of course, was the attorney for David Greenglass.
Yes.
He was his attorney, and also for Ruth Greenglass. One of them is what's called at the time a photostat, kind of like a copy or a Xerox, of a handwritten memo that is in David Greenglass's own handwriting. And among other things, he says that he agreed to say things or leave things written in an FBI statement that he did not remember. In other words, that he agreed to allow some things that weren't true to be put in that statement. In this handwritten note or document by David Greenglass, or would appear to be by David Greenglass, he also laid out approximately what he had told the FBI. And notably, Julius Rosenberg was barely implicated. David only said that he was, quote, that he told the FBI he was, quote, very close to this situation. And Ethel was not mentioned by David to the FBI as doing anything at all. In other words, the trial testimony was all false.
Yeah.
But additionally, the Rogue Papers also contained a memo written by Herbert Fabricant, who was an attorney at O. John Rogue's law firm. Herbert Fabricant says that he visited the offices of the FBI and that he met with David Greenglass, and that David Greenglass had, among other things, told him that he made a number of confusing statements purposely in order to confound the FBI and draw attention from his wife, who was in the hospital. His wife apparently originally told him that his brother-in-law, Julius Rosenberg, had suggested this. So I fail to see how his mind operated in connection with keeping his wife out of the picture. He told me that Julius Rosenberg was apparently very close to the situation. Julius had once introduced him to a man in a car somewhere. Rogue Papers also contain a memo from an attorney who very early on had interviewed Ruth Greenglass, so way before she's testified at the grand jury and before really she's even talked to the FBI. And she said to that attorney, in confidence, David would say things are so even if they're not, and had a tendency to hysteria. And this formed the basis of my favorite picket sign from the Committee to Secure Justice in the Rosenberg case, in giant letters, "My husband is a hysteric and a liar, Ruth Greenglass," which you just want to be really specific about the issue you're talking about in this case.
Yeah, that's good.
So the Committee to Secure Justice in the Rosenberg case is sent a copy, a photostat, of these rogue papers documents by the French newspaper, and they then take it to a document examiner, Elizabeth McCarthy, previously worked in the Alger Hiss case. She examines the writing and the known writing of David Greenglass, which they have examples of from various sources, including some of the exhibits at the trial of his own writing. She concludes these are definitely written by David Greenglass. Eventually, they're shown to O. John Rogue himself, and he says, yes, these appear to be documents from my file, but he still has the originals in his file. All of which kind of beg the question of how they got the papers in the case. Now, O. John Rogue made a very public statement that someone must have, quote, filched the papers from my file. These papers that appear to show that the lead witnesses did indeed fabricate their testimony, were actually lying, and maybe create some doubts at the case on the 11th hour. And indeed, maybe there's some truth to that. That's one possibility. The FBI had an informant who was an informant within the Committee to Secure Justice in the Rosenberg case, who said that the committee had paid $25,000 to a professional burglar to break into O. John Rogue's office and find these documents. I think all of these things kind of sidestep the fact that, yes, it's very bad to break into an attorney's office. These are very embarrassing. They're also very true in showing fabrication by David Ruth.
I love getting that job on the, in the organizing committee, the finding a burglar job, contacting burglars, getting them, other criminals too, arsonists, horse thieves.
The DSA steering committee, okay, look, you have to go ahead and create new membership. We need an election committee. We need a committee to really build a pool of black funds. To get our professional criminals to break into a law office. It was always pretty weird from the start, but obviously that's what the FBI would love to have, is somehow be able to wind up the whole committee or arrest the leadership for breaking into a law office. But it also kind of reminds me a bit of like any time that something happens to Republicans, or frankly, Joe Biden's also pulled this card too, of when like an incriminating thing is pulled out under suspicious circumstances. They're like, hey, who broke into my laptop? Or like, how dare the FBI come into the Trump's house? How dare this happen to us?
We're barons. The Magna Carta applies to us.
As David Allman really lays out in his book Exoneration, the circumstances of how the rogue papers were obtained really seems to suggest that the person who sent it out was O. John Rogue himself.
Maybe he feels bad for having fumbled the ball, as we discussed in episode 2.
He was a very left-wing progressive guy, at least at one time. He distanced himself further and further from the communists, but back in 1948, he was a Progressive Party candidate, right up there with Henry Wallace and all of the other kind of fellow traveler types. But I think that Allman's probably right that he was struck with or maybe someone working in his firm, but probably him was struck with a real crisis of conscience in knowing what he knew. That he wasn't putting David on the stand and direct examining and asking David these questions, but he did know that some of the stuff David said was lying, and in particular about Ethel. There was no mention of her at first, and then the FBI talked to him a little bit and surprised it was there. And from the beginning, at least according to the Rogue papers, David was saying to the FBI that there were things in their statement that he didn't remember. And there were other things that they put in the statement later on that he didn't remember at first, and that weren't true. And they also knew from Ruth that David just makes stuff up. And also is a hysteric, who at one time ran through the hallways naked, saying that he had steel pants, seeing elephants.
That sounds like delirium tremens. Was he a drinker?
Actually, I don't know. I mean, he did drink on occasion, but I haven't seen anything that suggested that David was an alcoholic or anything like that. It does sound like that, right? I didn't think that. So with these papers in hand, originally the committee took them to Manny Block, the Rosenberg's attorney, and he immediately thought that these were dangerous and possibly a ploy to get him arrested and the entire Rosenberg defense effort wound up. Because documents that are from a defense attorney's confidential files don't just appear. So he thought this was a plan. But when he himself confirmed that they were authentic, and when John Rugg publicly confirmed they were authentic, he had no choice but to treat them as new evidence on the case that David and Ruth Greenglass had perjured themselves and that the FBI knew it. He was helped in that new appeal by another piece of evidence that the committee helped discover in the case. Now, I've talked a lot about the console table and my obsession with this piece of evidence, but this is the part in 1953 where they found the fucking console table. So at trial, just to refresh everyone's memory.
Yes, the console table.
Just to refresh everyone's memory, Ruth Greenglass testified that at Julius and Ethel's apartment was a console table. It's a wooden table, okay? Not let the adjective really obscure things here. A wooden table that had a special compartment where a light existed so they could put a document in front of it, it would be lit up, and there would be an arm extension where you could put a camera over it and take pictures of documents, one right after the other, very rapidly. In other words, that it was a spy table. And that Julius and Ethel acknowledged that it was a gift to them from the Russians for doing spy work and to help them do spy work. Julius, in his own testimony at trial, said that he had bought a table at Macy's for $21 himself. It was not a gift from the Russians. It was a cheap wooden table. The table was just a table.
Yes.
For a while, no one could find this table. And I think, in all honesty, that Julius and Ethel, for some time, thought that it wouldn't be significant. It's certainly not the most significant item of testimony or anything like that. However, the defense team did look for the table because if they could show that the table was just a table from Macy's that he would have bought for $21, then they would have a piece of physical evidence that showed that David and Ruth had lied.
Yes.
So they did find the table, finally, had been stored with a bunch of other items at Julius Rosenberg's mother's apartment. And of course, when they found this and examined it, there was not a special compartment in there for a light-up bulb. And as was found later on in the 1993 mock trial, several of the one of the witnesses of the Rosenberg case was actually a housekeeper who would come by, once a month, something like that, clean up the place. And she corroborated David and Ruth's testimony about there being a console table. And she said sometimes Ethel and Julius would store the console table in the closet. Now, as it happens, friend of the show, Seth, was, in the early 90s, a super at the building where Julius and Ethel Rosenberg's apartment was.
That's wild.
And was asked by a team of lawyers working for the American Bar Association, kind of re-examining the case for this mock trial that would happen then, to go into the apartment and photograph the closet area and measure it and everything else. Because what they were able to show was that small closet was not big enough to store that fucking console table.
It's one of the things about this sort of investigation is that you have to focus on stuff like table dimensions and God knows what else.
You have to really just nerd stuff up because what is, you don't know in advance what's the thing that's going to be a kind of immovable piece of evidence that contradicts the case against you or the case for you. But in this case, it was a console table. So they found the console table, and not only did they find that, they were able to show it to a guy who worked at R.H. Macy's in the 1940s when Julius said he bought the console table, and it cost around $21. And he was able to testify to that and write in an affidavit rather. But of course, this was all after the trial. So what we have here is two separate sources, like vivid evidence of perjury. New evidence in the case, new shit has come to light.
I've got information, man. New shit has come to light.
So they take this to Judge Kaufman, who tells them pound sand. They file a motion with Judge Kaufman. He denies the motion. It takes him 15 minutes to deny the motion because he's already written his opinion denying the motion. They appeal to the Second Circuit, who also denies the motion, and then they're taking it to the Supreme Court, asking the Supreme Court to grant a stay of execution and to grant or reconsider their non-grant of certiorari and hear the new evidence on the case. Or, this is an alternative scenario here, to remand the case, which is to send the case back down to the lower court and force that, vacate Judge Kaufman's opinion and say, Judge Kaufman, you have to consider this new evidence in light of X, Y, or Z. Now, Judge Kaufman already gave an opinion. So we have this new claim before the court, is what I'm trying to say. The court doesn't hear it.
And this is the Supreme Court, the state court?
The Supreme Court decides not to hear it. They vote not to hear this new evidence claim, even with the raw papers and even with the console table.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they do this without actually hearing any argument.
It's the same sort of procedural thing you were talking about before.
Yeah, this is even a little bit more dismissive. So they hear this without any argument, and most of the argument that was made to them was actually on the earlier claims and asking them to reconsider on that.
Mm-hmm.
But at this point, the added to the team of the Rosenbergs attorneys is a University of Chicago professor, Malcolm Sharp, who has, by reading the stuff that's being put out by the Committee to Secure Justice Rosenberg Case, has changed his mind and has thought that a major injustice may have been done here. And also a fucking legend that basically no one knows about or remembers anymore, but should be known. A guy named John Finnerty.
Yeah, I don't know him.
Yeah, I didn't know him either before this case. So John Finnerty was a radical labor lawyer and amazingly criminal lawyer who was involved in some of the biggest, most controversial cases in kind of the bloodiest time for for American labor and for the American left. Probably his biggest case was for a guy named Tom Mooney, and I won't get into that, but basically Tom Mooney was a very, very well-known left-wing Irish labor leader in California who got accused of bombing the 1916 Preparedness Day parade. So it would be almost as if a very well-known, DSA person or a major labor leader was all of a sudden arrested for the Boston Marathon bombing. He also helped defend Sacco and Vanzetti. Finnerty is always described as being this giant man. And so I was surprised when I actually looked at pictures of him at this time that he's just a pretty normal Irish man.
Yeah.
And I can only think that it must have been because John Finnerty was such a presence that people around him were just this guy's huge.
Yeah, you run into that sometimes.
You can see why, because when the court kind of tells the Supreme Court tells Emanuel Bloch to go away, John Finnerty uses physical force to save the Rosenbergs and physically pounds his way through multiple U.S. Marshals to file a motion in the best way possible, which is to yell at Supreme Court Justice Vinson that he wants to file a writ of habeas corpus, and how dare you, this is the greatest travesty unless you hear my motion right now. And this totally works.
He would have been smoked today.
Yeah, he absolutely would have been shot today. But back then, they'd just be he's
an Irish man.
Yeah, Irish people, they get a little wild.
That's what they do. We've let them in the country now.
I also want to believe that they're just physically afraid of John Finnerty. Yeah. Just be pa, pa.
Yeah.
Let me file this motion right now and be
okay. We'll just not vote to look at it.
So he did file the habeas petition, and he actually was able to argue the points that the court should grant a stay of execution, at least, and maybe let the lower courts hear the evidence on this case, because there's this new evidence that shows perjury. And the precedent that he argues here is the Mooney case. Now, in the Mooney case, the chief witnesses turned out to be confirmed perjurers who eventually recanted all of their statements. And that was the basis of the prosecution. They were two guys who were trying to get the reward money that was offered on the Preparedness Day bombing. And as it happens, they gave the prosecutor the suspect that they wanted, who also happened to be causing a lot of trouble with labor relations, as far as they were concerned. So the Supreme Court actually issued a decision in the Mooney case called In Re Mooney, which is in the matter of Tom Mooney, that says if the case against you is based on subordination of perjury, so perjury that the prosecutor or a member of their team, in this case the FBI, asked for and received, then that's a denial of your right to due process. You didn't get a fair trial, and the verdict has to be gotten rid of.
Yeah,
you have to start over.
Pretty fundamental.
Seems obvious.
Yeah.
So he argued, this shows perjury. It shows that the prosecutor and the FBI suborned it. New trial.
Yeah. The console table. It was sold to Macy's.
Yeah. The table was a table. And David Greenglass is hysteric and a liar.
Yeah.
Frankfurter, Burton, and Justice Black voted to grant a stay of execution so the lower courts could hear this argument. Douglas, hero of liberals, votes against, saying Mooney doesn't apply.
Oof.
He was in talking to Justice Frankfurter, says that no, it's not enough to suborn perjury. You have to actually manufacture the evidence. And I don't really know what that means.
Yeah.
Like, so unless like the prosecutor like gave birth to David Greenglass and like programmed his mind.
Yeah.
Or maybe like hypnotize him in the state of lying.
Yeah. Get a hypnotist.
Like, unless he did some MK Ultra stuff on David Greenglass.
They were a little too early.
Yeah. It doesn't apply. So he votes against. No stay of execution. And so it looks like the execution is going to proceed. So there's only a couple of days left at this point in the legal process. Now, parallel with this, you have people trying to put pressure on President Eisenhower to grant clemency, which means I'm not making a judgment on like the merits of the case or whatever. I'm just changing the penalty because I can do it because the people of the United States elected me.
Yeah.
But this is the last chance on this case, and at this point, Manny Block and other attorneys are throwing everything they can. The judges are basically picking up the phone and hanging up, essentially.
Yeah.
Or picking it up and respectfully listening to it and then hanging up the phone after saying denied. But kind of out of nowhere, you have this weird bolt out of the blue argument by an eccentric country lawyer from Tennessee.
Okay.
And I like to think of this as like the Shishin Liu like dimension shard that like comes into the case, and all of a sudden a lawyer is like snatching the heart out of this case.
Yeah, like a sophon.
Everyone's going back and forth on issues of whether there's a sufficient basis for saying that there was perjury, whether the prosecutor knew about it, whether the prosecutor did misconduct, whether the judge did misconduct. By the way, Frankfurter thought, and repeatedly said in private, that he thought the judge and the prosecutor, Irving Sapel, were guilty of the worst misconduct on this case. Fike Farmer, which sounds like a fake name. Who's named Fike?
Who indeed?
No, I literally, can you think of another person in all of human history?
I've heard of last names. I've seen the last name Fike, so it might be a family name.
Yeah, so maybe they made the last name the first name.
Yeah,
the first name became Fike Farmer, the aforementioned eccentric Tennessee lawyer, is really concerned about atomic energy. He reads lots of things on atomic energy. He's an atomic energy nerd, an atom head.
Yeah.
He notices that the indictment is under the Espionage Act, which everyone knows is from the Espionage Act of 1917. As it happens, Congress passed a little thing called the Atomic Energy Act in 1946. Under that act, it says that if you were to if you take any other documents or atomic secrets, it specifies its own standards for how to prove the case and what the penalty is. And they're not the same as the Espionage Act standard. So under that Atomic Energy Act, if you take any atomic secrets, you can only be found guilty if the prosecutors proven beyond a reasonable doubt that you took those atomic secrets with intent to injure the United States. And there can't be a death penalty imposed on you if you took those atomic secrets without a jury recommending it. In other words, the judge can't do it like Judge Kaufman did.
Yeah.
So on both points, if they were tried under the Atomic Energy Act of 46, the Rosenbergs at least couldn't be sentenced to death and probably couldn't even be found guilty. The United States and the Soviet Union were allies.
Yeah. There's
no testimony that they intended to injure the United States, so they were like trying to get the atomic secrets.
And the Atomic Energy Act provisions, because they came later, would supersede the 1917 Espionage Act.
At least in this instance. The problem is the Rosenbergs were accused of doing what they did in 1945.
Yes.
But here's where Fike Farmer has another parry. The trial was for a conspiracy to commit espionage that lasted from 44 to 1950.
Okay.
So
some of it is after 1946.
And in fact, the bulk of the testimony is about things that the Rosenbergs did, like telling Greenglass he needs to leave the country and giving him money and talking to David about this or that. That happens after 1946. So Fike Farmer at first calls Judge Kaufman, who says some variation of "Who the fuck are you? I'm not listening to any dumb hicks."
Yeah.
And your motion is denied, obviously. And using his own money and a friend of his, or a civil libertarian from LA named David Marshall, also joins in on this. He marches off to the Supreme Court. And it also arrives there about the same time as the assembly of defense attorneys who are also trying to make these arguments for the new evidence claim. His claim is denied, although the court pointedly finds it very hard to understand, because it's kind of weird for someone to come in and be like, well, actually, if you look at the law here, not only could they not be sentenced to death, it looks like they're not guilty. It has nothing to do with the evidence on the case, nothing to do with the trial conduct. It's just like, whoops, this entire thing
forgot about a law.
Was wrong from the beginning. Yeah. Just whoops. You all messed up.
Nobody wants to hear that.
No one wants to admit that you've been just circling around for 3 years under the wrong law. But Fike Farmer manages to get Justice Douglas, who is just voted to not grant a stay of execution, to grant a stay of execution on the basis of this new weird claim that he wouldn't grant on the new evidence claim.
Right, because it's not new evidence that implies that he believes what communists have to say about things. It's proceduralism, which you gotta be procedural.
Judge Douglas has a story that he granted this stay, and then he was arriving at a train station right afterwards in Pennsylvania, and then hearing that the liberal lion Justice Douglas granted this stay, a group of Eastern European miners picked him up and carried him aloft in the crowd. Yeah, everyone else says this is a lie.
Yeah, if anything, well, yeah.
Now, do I believe a group of Eastern European miners would have been pro-Rosenberg? Yes. Do I think that Justice Douglas was recognized by anyone?
Random miners,
and that they will be waiting at the train station?
Yeah.
As miners do, just wait at the train station.
Yeah.
Is that a Supreme Court justice? No.
Preferred miner hangout.
Yeah. So Douglas granted the stay on this question, but the head of Harry Truman's and now Dwight Eisenhower's law firm, Justice Vinson, the old battle axe, hears about this and is enraged because that last set of arguments that they heard with John Finnerty pushing U.S. Marshals aside and making his arguments on the basis of the Mooney case, which he was the lawyer on, and all that argument about that, after that last denial of stay, the court went on recess. And they're supposed to all be on recess, not hearing cases, not doing any business until next October. So with this stay granted and with the court dismissed, theoretically, the Rosenbergs should be alive at least until October, when the Supreme Court can hear argument on the stay. But Judge Vinson doesn't accept that. And he orders all of the justices back, which might actually be totally illegal. It's certainly not been done again, but he brought back the full court involuntarily and voted.
Douglas had to leave the train station off the backs of the miners.
Yeah, the judges come back, and 4 judges vote to continue the stay. But as I said before, you need 4 judges to grant a hearing for the appeal of the Supreme Court, but you need a majority of 5 in order to not kill someone. Or at least to continue not killing someone when you have the full court in panel. So 5 judges vote to get rid of Justice Douglas' stay, and the execution date is on. Now, as Michael Mirapol told us in our episode with him, he has it on good authority, and this lines up with what's been found by that Frankfurter biographer that I mentioned, that in a phone call by people who know, they asked not to vacate Justice Douglas' stay and allow the Rosenbergs to live, and that Justice Vinson told them they have to fry.
The majesty of the law, folks. Well, presumably, Dwight David Eisenhower, he could have saved the day.
Indeed. So this gets to the clemency petition. So clemency, of course, is when a governor or the president, the chief executive in an area, for whatever reason that they state, maybe just mercy, maybe mitigating evidence like the circumstances of the case, decides to change the sentence or to issue a full pardon in certain cases. So the Committee to Secure Justice, the Rosenberg Case, had really been reaching out to congressmen and well-known people like writers, actors, and everything, scientists who were familiar with how the atomic bomb was made. to urge clemency on the case. And a lot of people fell in behind the petition for clemency and wrote in lots of cables and telegrams were sent to the White House and so on. For example, Albert Einstein said, "My conscience compels me to urge you to commute the death sentence of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg." Harold Urey, as I said before, who observed the trial, also wrote in. Also people like W.B. Du Bois, Nelson Algren, the writer Izzy I. F. Stone, Walden Frank, Dashiell Hammett, the king, the legend. Actors and singers like Ossie Davis, Paul Robeson, Ruby Dee, Gail Sondergaard, Howard Da Silva. And then scientists like E.U. Condon, Philip Morrison, who also worked on the Manhattan Project, Gene Weltfish, Linus Pauling, another physicist, I believe, artists like Rockwell Kent, Robert Gwathmey, and Pablo fucking Picasso.
Well, you could see how, I mean, who knows what Eisenhower would have thought, because he was something of a sphinx figure, but you could see Dulles or somebody looking at that list and say, all the usual suspects.
Yeah, exactly, and that's exactly how they denounced him, too.
Yeah.
There were something like 300 different ministers and rabbis who also urged clemency, but the surprise one for me was behind the scenes, Joe McCarthy said he was in favor of clemency.
Wow.
Was afraid of going public on it. Yes.
Why?
Because Emily and David Ullman actually found that they were able to get a lot of support for not executing the Rosenbergs from congressmen, but all of them were afraid to go public.
No, I mean, why was McCarthy in favor of clemency?
That's a little unclear. I think it was largely because of the death penalty aspect of it.
He was Catholic.
Yeah. The Pope reportedly came out in favor of clemency, but then the New York Times came out and said that the Pope wasn't in favor of clemency, but then he came out with a statement saying he urged mercy in the case.
Yeah.
So with all this in mind, Eisenhower rejected doing clemency, and in his statements, he kind of just confesses how little he knew or cared about anything on the case. This is at a time when there's round-the-clock pickets at the White House, and I can just see Eisenhower looking outside and being like, communists.
Yeah.
So he said, quote, "All rights of appeal were exercised and the conviction of the trial court was upheld after a full judicial review, including that of the highest court in the land, even though the Supreme Court literally said in their final opinion, we have never considered the merits of this case. We just never heard it."
Yeah. But they voted not to hear it, which is good enough.
Yeah. Continuing with Eisenhower, "I have made a careful examination in this case, and am satisfied that the two individuals have been accorded their full measure of justice. There has been neither new evidence nor has there been mitigating circumstances which would justify altering this decision, and I have determined that it is my duty in the interest of the people of the United States not to set aside the verdict of their representatives." So literally says that the Supreme Court heard it and says that there's no new or mitigating evidence, even though there was new evidence and the Supreme Court never heard it. In the cabinet meeting that was held close in time to his first denial of clemency, he stated that all the officials who considered the case were unanimous, and even though they weren't, as we know from the Supreme Court, and that the reversal of the verdict when the case was so, quote, clear-cut would be negative. In private, however, he opined that Ethel Rosenberg was actually like the mastermind, which I just think is the most anti-Semitic part of this case.
Yeah.
Eisenhower, the chief wasp of the United States.
The chief German of the United States.
Yes, the chief German of the United States was basically like, you know how those Jewish women are. They always find their husbands.
And oh my God.
Honey, I don't want to go out spying tonight. You go out spying.
Oh, so help me. Is he the only person who thinks that? Because I've never heard anyone advance that opinion before.
No, so even Judge Kaufman in his statement on the case said that Julius was clearly like the mastermind here, but Ethel was a full partner because she's 3 years his senior, or for the 4 years his senior. Anyways, there's no way he got this from J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI, who was recommending that Ethel not be executed, and kind of walked that back a bit. But he recommended to Kaufman that she not be executed. Right. He wasn't getting this from anyone. There was even, the national security people who knew in some dissembled sense about Venona, although Eisenhower himself did not know about the Venona project. He just knew that there was sources that they had. Were recommending Ethel not to be executed. Because they knew that she they didn't have evidence that she did anything.
Shades of Eddie Slovik. Because Eisenhower was in charge of that, too.
Who's Eddie Slovik?
Eddie Slovik was the only American executed for desertion during World War II. And he was a minor cause célèbre as well. He was like this, he was a draftee, he was like an ex-con, kind of just a ne'er-do-well who was I don't know a ton about the case, but there was no really good military reason to execute him. They thousands of GIs deserted and weren't executed.
Yeah, what made him special in any way?
Nothing. They just got him, and he didn't have any defense, and Eisenhower and the rest just decided to make an example of him during the Battle of the Bulge.
So in that fine tradition, he does not commute the sentence, and of course he's really kind of like the last appeal because he's the only one who could permanently stop the death sentence. Once it's commuted, he can't reinstate it or whatever. So at Sing Sing prison in what's called the death house, their segregated death row section. Julius and Ethel, who haven't seen each other, it's obviously segregated wings for men and women. At this point, their rabbi, who's kind of consulting with them in the last moments, the government's in communication with them too, and he's imploring Julius to name names to try to get a stay of execution straight from the president. Implores Ethel to name names. She defiantly tells him, I am innocent, I have no names. But the FBI passes along questions, both to the warden and others who are in communication with Julius, a final set of questions in the hopes that in these final hours, he'll break. And one of the questions is essentially, I think, a kind of confession of murder on their part, or what will be, which is, was your wife cognizant of your activities? They've convicted this person. They fought all of the appeals. And at the end of the day, the FBI, the investigating agency on the case, is just saying, hey, honestly, we don't know. Did your wife know what you even did? Because,
she's here in the death house.
We're about to kill her because we said not only did she know, we've claimed in every court in this country, not only did she know what you did, but that she did it with you. But we know that was all a lie, so just tell us the truth. Did she actually know what she did? They were originally scheduled to be executed at 11 p.m. on Thursday, June 18th, their 14th wedding anniversary. When the Supreme Court overturned Justice Douglas's stay, that was moved to 8:31 p.m. on the 19th, which would have been past sundown and on Shabbat. It was originally scheduled for 11 p.m. on June 19th, that Friday, which would have been Shabbat. The government then moved it up to 8:04 p.m., so just before sundown. And Julius was strapped to the big wooden chair at Sing Sing prison and killed with 3 shocks of 2,000 volts. It was pronounced dead at 8:06 p.m. 5 minutes later, having removed Julius's body, Ethel walked in the room, not knowing her husband was already dead, and was strapped to the same chair. And 3 electric shocks later, her heart was still beating. It was a botched execution. And so they administered more shocks, and she died. They held a memorial service with 12,000 mourners. It's pretty barbaric by itself that the United States even ever operated the electric chair, which was a colossal case of capitalist fraud. Thomas Edison wanted to show that alternating current was very deadly.
Yeah.
So that people shouldn't use Nikola Tesla's things. And therefore, he operated an electric chair using alternating current. The human body is not a natural transmitter of electricity. There is no exact voltage that suddenly and painlessly stops the human heart.
Yeah.
And accordingly, many executions are botched executions with the electric chair because there's no telling at any voltage if the person's heart will painlessly stop after a volt or two, or whether they'll end up being cooked inside. It is, as Justice Brennan later pronounced, simply burning at the stake with modern technology. And because we often or at least back then, they often wouldn't see the effects going on inside.
Mm-hmm.
They could shield themselves from thinking that they were doing essentially a brutal torture. And pause for a second on that one. It's an odd point in the presentation here to say any note of optimism, but I'd like to introduce a counterfactual, which is always brought up, and usually for the wrong reasons on this case, which is, what if Julius had talked? What if he started saying, I did this and that with Joel Barr and William Pearl and other former CCNY classmates who he had gotten older with and had laughed and had struggled against fascism with and had shared stories during the war with and had enlisted in this enterprise to a great degree? What if he had named names? And therefore, what if there wasn't an international movement to stop the executions of the Rosenbergs? What if he had just broken? And I think we actually have our answer of what would have happened, because that's what David Greenglass did. David Greenglass took the choice of, I'm not going to become a martyr. I'm going to make the smart decision. I like my odds. I'll take the prison time. I'll take the reduced sentence and name names. And it only took a month or two before they had David Greenglass just making up stories about people, where they had him making up evidence. Mm-hmm. Even when David Greenglass voiced that Ethel had no part in this, eventually the pressure of a potential death sentence, a potential life sentence, never being able to see his wife or kids again, was enough to make him make up a story against his own sister. Mm-hmm. And if in that possible world, Julius or Ethel had broken and named those other people, then the circle just expands wider. Mm-hmm. It's like a chain reaction with neutrons bouncing on other atoms and other neutrons until you have an explosion. Yeah. How many people, hundreds of people, could have potentially been rounded up if you just had such a ethicsless prosecution, getting person after person to collaborate and manufacture?
And to the extent there seems to be any kind of sane motivation here on the part of people like Kaufman, it does seem to have been precisely that, to hold this over the head of these two people so that they could name names and round up more leftists, more communists, and, do God knows what with them.
Yeah, I mean, we have some idea of what they would do, even though it's very speculative. Emily and David Allman pointed out that under the McCarran Internal Security Act, the government of the United States was already building internment camps, because if and when communists could be determined to be such a collaborator enemy, like the Japanese previously during World War II, the pressure to round them up and detain them on the basis of membership in communist organizations and quote-unquote front groups would be enough that they could be put in there. And Emily and David Allman actually said that at one point they found out their prospective numbers, that they had talked to ex-prison guards who were being recruited by federal recruiters to work in the camps, but with no collaboration with the authorities, with no naming names, that circle couldn't be expanded.
Yeah, no naming names and the creation of a grassroots movement around them, proof that even if they couldn't save the Rosenbergs, that there would be substantial public backlash to high-handed behavior on the part of the government, even towards communists, that there was some limit to the American people's ability or credulity when it came to going along with the Red Scare.
Yeah. And I mean, I think there's always like a little bit of an element of like LARPing when people claim a legacy, a political legacy on the left. But I would say that the legacy of this independent movement to save the Rosenbergs, kind of resist this hysteria, is one that forms our consciousness even to some extent, even if we don't know it.
Right.
Before this, there was you couldn't simply go up and say the FBI, not just some like local police department or a local prosecutor, but the FBI, the clean agency. They wouldn't manufacture a case to advance an agenda of breaking the left. But after that becomes the left's suspicion.
Right.
Presumptive suspicion.
And it gets confirmed by things like the Medea break-in And,
Yeah.
it gets confirmed over and over again.
Yeah.
So, in many respects, I've heard it said that the American left's legacy is one largely of defeat. There's some truth to that, like there is of most cliches. But I actually think that there's a certain extent to which our legacy is snatching some sort of victory from these fights that we have against overwhelming odds. The whole story of the Rosenbergs is a story of decks being laboriously stacked against them, and they were killed. That was a failure. Whether it's a culpable one on the part of the American left or not, or not even but. And that failure led to the development of consciousness and of actual social forces that would go forward to kind of carry on the struggle, broadly speaking. And at the end of the day, that's what a force that is overwhelmingly outnumbered, overwhelmingly outgunned, needs more than anything. It's just to stay in existence and find its opportunities.
Stay in existence. Talk to your friends. Go out and do things.
Touch grass.
If there's any... I feel like there's a lovely example from Julius and Ethel in their days that when the left was very ascendant and also enduring from when it was not, that they stayed close with their friends and comrades. And to them, it was a joyous struggle in which we're all involved.
Yeah. So turn off your podcast, except ours.
Go hang out with your friends.
Go hang out with your friends.
Hang out, have a drink.
Yeah, it's good.
Enjoy.
Yeah.
And on that note, thank you again, listeners. Also, thank you to our sources for this episode. As I said, that legal paper, Taking Great Cases, Emily and David Ullman's exoneration, Walter and Miriam Schneer's invitation to an inquest and final verdict, and for this episode in particular, on the legal questions, Fatal Error by Joseph Charlotte, criminally out of print, as well as Michael and Robert Mirapol's We Are Your Sons. Thanks again, listeners. That's all for now. See you next time.
Bye-bye.